Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to the MineWarp Podcast, wherever you are in the world. This is, of course, the podcast where we talk about everything new and innovative in the natural resources industries and related industries. And our specific focus is typically around digital solutions, but digitization, automation, electrification are almost different flavors of the same discussion these days. And today we're going to delve a little bit more into the electrification side of the discussion. I look forward to spending the time with you all. Thank you again for joining the MineWarp Podcast. It's always great that you make the time to listen to our guests, and I make it my mission to find really good guests, and I'm sure today will not disappoint you at all. Our guest today is Louis Strydom, no relation to me, even though we have the same surname. Louis is Director of Growth and Development at Wärtsilä Energy. I hope I didn't completely murder that company name, Louis. Welcome to the MineWarp Podcast.
Thank you, Peter. You got it very well right. It's great to be here and great to be joining you.
Louis and I met a few months ago at a think tank, a discussion group, a whatever you want to call it, a work group, looking at setting up a large global company to be ready for innovation. We discussed the whole approach to innovation and different ways of creating a culture of innovation in the company, and I really enjoyed what Louis had to say there, and that was the trigger for me to contact him and ask if he would be kind enough to join us on the podcast. And I'm really happy that he said yes. Before we start talking about the topic properly, Louis, why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us who you are and where you are from and what you do now and so on.
Thank you for having me again, Empie. And just by way of quick background, I started off years ago more on the finance side of things, moved gradually over into developing infrastructure projects. And then at some point, my path found me to Wartsila. At the moment, I look after Africa and Europe for the growth and development team. And our focus is really about understanding how our value proposition fits into the market and understanding what our customers' pain points and frictions are and how we need to align resources to be able to solve those.
Thanks for that. I noted on noticed on your LinkedIn profile that your qualifications, of which there are plenty to speak of, but that you have a dual interest in it seems technology and innovation, but also a deep background in finance. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, it started off in economics and then kind of moved over towards more general MBA stuff. And then at some point I got more into innovation and entrepreneurship as well. But yeah, I mean, finance, you need it in your discussions, and taking it back to innovation, without the bucks and the story about how you're going to make the bucks, it's pretty hard to sell it. So it actually proves very useful there. But right now, actually looking more at the computer science side of things, purely because I think as innovation changes now, we will need to be able, at the front line, at the front end of the business, better be able to understand how to apply all the AI and machine learning and all the other clever stuff coming in.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to do business without also doing technology and being fluent in both, because well, I don't know exactly how old you are, but you don't seem like you were born post 2000, so you're not a digital native. You're also a little bit of a digital immigrant, and yet the water that we swim in these days is one where everybody expects just fluent, integrated systems and solutions and digitally embedded thinking and so on. And I'm sure, given the electrification world in which you find yourself, and with all of the rapid innovation that takes place there must be a very close relationship between the digital world and the electrification world and growing into the future, isn't there?
Very much so. But I think just touching on one point, you were talking about us digital immigrants, and it is also for the corporation to move from a digital immigrant mindset to a digital native mindset. And I think that is really going to take some time still. You know, what's happening in the environment. I mean, there's obviously leading and innovating companies, but, you know, for most large corporates, it's still a big transition that needs to come. So just one point I wanted to raise there, but
that's definitely true. And it's unrealistic to think that companies will become mature digital citizens without growing through the maturity curves of becoming mature in digital, just as they have to become mature in other things. You know, there are the maturity curve discussion is one that I always find interesting, because it's almost impossible to jump levels. You have to grow through them. You can fast track them, but you have to adopt that level, adopt the thinking, learn the principles, get rid of the heroes, and you know, establish the process thinking, etc., before you can, and the systems thinking, of course, that goes along with that. And you know, no stranger to systems thinking, are you?
Absolutely, but it's very true what you say. I mean, embedding this kind of digital first approach is going to take time, and it is, as you say, across a maturity curve. It comes with time. Very similar to innovation, right? In most cases, you can't just install a new software or say, here's a new program. It takes time to build up the cultural momentum behind that to actually make it effective.
So in this series of the podcast, we are kind of connecting with four types of people: innovators or inventors, and then investors that help innovators to take their innovation to the world, or I should say to maturity. And then the implementers from industry who adopt the technology or the innovation, and then the igniters that are able to cross the bridge between feature and benefit, you know, and value finally, you know, and help innovators to express their technology in value terminology and so on. And even that is a maturity thing. Speaking of innovators, Wartsila is a global leader in innovation, right? When it comes to life cycle solutions for marine, interestingly, but specifically energy markets as well. And that's where you fit in the energy markets part. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, the backbone really is our engine expertise, but that gets applied to these two different industries. And it's also interesting to see how it gets applied differently because your customers are different. They have different needs, and that means the portfolios are also somewhat different. But indeed, our focus is on the energy space.
So let me jump into that then, and I'm going to ask you a big framing question, and then we can drill down a little bit. So what do people still misunderstand today about energy transition, and especially when it comes to large-scale, energy-hungry industries like mining, of course, and manufacturing and so on? What do you run into among the immigrants that you have to deal with?
It's a great question. I think probably the first thing is, I mean, it took a while, but then everybody kind of got into the idea of we can put some solar and wind turbines or whatever, and we produce cheaper and greener electricity. That's great, and it's a good, you have to start there, right? But going beyond that, and if you look at energy across your system, take a typical mine, for example, I think the one thing is, you know, that balance between electricity and other kind of fuels and things you use directly in process. Exactly. So molecules and electrons interplay. And each mine has a different kind of interplay between these molecules and electrons. So I'm saying mine, but it could apply to anything. So whether it's district heating or anything else, that interplay is becoming more complex. And then the other thing is, as new technologies come in, you suddenly end up with this portfolio of changes to your business.
Right.
And you've got different technologies, and what people don't always appreciate is how those technologies interact with each other. You know, you may suddenly decide to electrify your vehicles. That's great, but that's going to put a different power demand to your generation side, for example.
Yes.
Or it could impact your demand side management or something like that. So I think the one is this big structural change, which is constantly evolving. And the other thing is the detail of change is becoming more important. Things, when you talk about electricity, it's not happening in these nice, today I'm going to produce so much electricity. With the intermittency of the renewables, with the high frequency changes in demand, etc., it is becoming much more granular. And whether you look at big power markets or whether you look at a mine, understanding what happens minute by minute is becoming incredibly important.
I saw a video that you made called something. Well, I don't want to give it a name, but you talked about the energy milkshake, right?
Yes.
In which you explained the landscape a little bit. Can you run us through the milkshake metaphor? We're not taking you too far back now, but let's see if we can shake the milk again.
No problem. The argument was this, right? So if we were using a milkshake for an analogy, because basically we're saying, let's say you had your standard vanilla flavored milkshake, and suddenly you come and you want to make this wonderful new green milkshake with even better flavors and everything.
Can I just interrupt you there?
Yeah.
Green milkshake does not sound good. Let's call it a brown milkshake.
Call it a brown milkshake. But the point is, let's say you make this really super delicious milkshake and you want to drink a lot more of it. The challenge still is in the straw, right? If your straw is too small and your mix is thicker or something like that, you get stuck. And the point is, we use that straw as an analogy for transmitting the electricity from one point to another. And it's not just the physical wire that needs to be more expanded, because grids globally need to be expanded, but it's also how that electricity gets measured across the transition process, managing the flows so that it's consistent. It doesn't kind of go in chunks. I mean, you want to drink a smooth milkshake. You don't want to, slurp at it and struggle to get it in. So that was basically the basis for the idea.
Right. And then the whole linking back to your molecules and electrons thing, the makeup of the milkshake is also important, right? I mean, in the sense that I heard someone say recently that it's less about availability and more about flexibility when it comes to the provision of energy, and that you have to be able to adapt and look at different sources and or different means of receiving the energy. Do you see a big change not only from, let's say, carbon-based energy or purchased energy to developing a portfolio of potential sources or potential types of energy that big industries adopt?
Yes, I think the flexibility is a key component, and it's becoming more and more important. Why? Because everybody will prefer to use the cheap solar and cheap wind when they can, because it's your cheapest form of energy. But
right,
to keep that flexible, and at the other end of flexibility is stability. To make sure that flexibility is stable is the most crucial thing. And what we're seeing is, as I said earlier, it's not just about the wind and solar, but about innovative new solutions, right? So electrifying certain parts of your industrial processes, for example, is going to change how your demand works. So to make sure that all of that use and all of that generation stays stable is becoming critical. So it's flexibility for stability. It's not just the flexibility on its own.
So what kind of innovations are you seeing, or maybe is Wärtsilä working on that excite you in the near future?
Well, I think a core, or a lot of it is around stability. Right. So the things we can see, I think it's a given that anybody that generates thermal energy in one shape or form will need to be able to be future-proof and provided as green fuels, right? So whether it's hydrogen or methanol or anything else, it it needs to be able to be ready for those things. So I take that as a given. And that is a big part of our R&D and development, of course. But there's so much more that's happening. I think at the front end, the work around decarbonizing and understanding that this story of being able to provide a flexible asset that gives stability and that helps the rest of the system run cost effectively is becoming more and more important. So we can see our engines need to be paired with the kind of software systems that can manage that stability and also give the client the comfort that there will be guarantees behind it. I think that's the one thing. Right. It's nice buying a product, but without the guarantee that it will perform the way it should, it also takes a lot of risk out. So we developing various things around that. We can also see in terms of a lot of our future users will be looking more at autonomous plants. In many countries, the cost of labor is high. It's lesser running facilities, but when they run, they have to be absolutely reliable. So the more you can automate those processes, the better. So we can see quite a bit happening around there. And then the other thing is integrating our technologies into district heating systems, for example, wherever you need the heat and cooling plus the power. Combining all of that together is becoming much more important. So we can see development around that. And finally, it's also bringing in things like synchronous condensers, etc., to actually have more stability in the grid when it's needed. So you don't have the big blackouts happening when you don't have enough inertia in the grids. So those are some of the key areas we're looking at.
It also seems to me like there's a continuous, I don't know whether it's a tension or just a vying for attention, but there's continuously different discussions on the technology around energy transition and decarbonization, which goes hand in hand, I'm sure. And of course, the discussion about the non-technical obstacles to accelerating the energy transitions, maybe things like regulatory items and financial costs associated and cultural pressures and so on. I've often wondered, and this is maybe very key in your portfolio where you look at developing markets, in Africa specifically, is it fair to expect of developing countries to adopt the same stance towards renewable energy and especially transitioning into renewables, which might seem like a double whammy when it comes to infrastructure? Does it really make sense for them to make that change, or are you more helping them with initial projects, maybe greenfields projects? What's the best for developing markets?
It's a really good question, Empie. I think the one thing we see in developing markets is that there is no silver bullet. As you were talking about the maturity curve earlier, it's the same thing with decarbonizing. You cannot walk in and expect a zero carbon system day one. If you look at any economy, it pollutes more as it develops and then gradually starts coming down once it reaches a certain point. Yeah. But without baseload, you don't have a proper economy. And it's the same for a mine.
There's no way to grow if you don't have a reliable
you have to have it. You have to have it. But the other thing that's really challenging is also the idea that everything has to run on gas. Let's take something like Africa. Where it's available, it's obviously a no-brainer. But once you start moving up country, take something like Zambia, for example, to get the infrastructure there to actually deliver cleaner fuel solutions is going to take a long time. So you have to accept at some point that you're still stuck on, diesel fuel oil or heavy fuel oil or whatever you can get. I think the main thing is to not kind of go for this zero carbon overnight, but rather say, what is my least cost decarbonization, least carbon route for decarbonization? So how do I minimize it, but accept that I will have to be running quite a large bit of carbon to get to the point where it actually can decarbonize it?
And then, of course, the costs associated with adopting new technologies can be extremely high, and it's often the developing regions that don't have access to that capital as readily. So is this something, I'm just thinking of your financial background, your economy background, is this something that you see lots of innovation in, not only on the technical side, but in helping both countries and companies to adopt or to find innovative ways of looking at financing these big projects and so on?
Yeah, and I'm talking specifically Africa here, but
Right.
it holds for some of the other developing countries in other markets as well. But it's sometimes very tough to bring in those new technologies. Somebody comes with a really good idea, but often what you find, especially from the financier's perspective, they want the known. So if you offer the innovative idea, they sometimes just shut off because there's too much risk in that, and they want a reliable project that they can project finance alongside the industry or the mining house or whoever the case may be. So I think the one thing that would really make a difference is where we say, okay, fine, we create the stable project, but a lot of the development institutions, multilaterals, etc., have risk capital available. And I think the one thing that could really make a difference to help get these newer technologies in is to actually say, fine, let's allocate a small portion of the 100 million project, allocate a small portion to help test and prove some of these new technologies, because you need that proof of concept, right? That's the moment when the technology can actually commercially deploy. And often, different service providers in the mining industry can see those technologies, but it's just everybody looks at it and says, yes, that's very nice, but I'll buy it when it's fully up and running and you can give me a reference. And that slows down the deployment of those technologies.
I'd like to be the first follower,
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, so it is definitely interesting. I have a friend who helps specifically mining companies with initial finance capital applications and so on, and this is a big part of what they have to do to model the cost of energy. But it's also interesting how that has started to change into an opportunity as much as a threat, where they can say, well, if I am able to demonstrate that I'm going to be a responsible citizen in the area that I'm going to, and if I'm going to be carbon, if not negative, then at least carbon responsible in the way that I approach my business, then that can have a very positive impact on the bottom line as well, and not only from a production cost perspective, but also that I can get better rates on loans, and I can get more referenceability in the community, and be an employer of choice, and all kinds of positive things that kind of spans beyond merely the benefit of the actual technology itself.
Yes, it's just touching on that actually. The one thing I think where there still needs to be a big mindset shift is right now, when you design the energy system for the mine, it's inward looking. And then sometimes it'll provide a little bit of power to the village next door or something like that. But if the utilities would actually see those opportunities as a potential energy producer to the grid and say, so instead of putting 100 megawatt plant, put 120 and we'll buy the 20 from you. Because the incremental cost of adding that additional amount on versus the benefit that the utilities could get by using that to connect into their grids is a lot. So I think if we could shift that mindset from an inward-focused power system to an outward-focused power system, and the governments participate and provide some security of offtake for that, it is something where both parties can win. and that electricity, gives you much more development impact as well.
So do you think the current, let's call it the pressure narrative or whatever you want to call it, around net zero timelines, is it helpful, or could it lead to resistance and maybe unintended consequences?
I think it is helpful, but it should be done with a dash of flexibility as well. As I say, it's not about net zero. Net zero is the end state. We all want to be at net zero, but helping and encouraging the planning of the path, the least carbon path to get to net zero, and understanding what needs to contribute both from new technologies, from finance, from risk sharing, from regulatory aspects is probably the thing that is needed most. And if you look at most corporates, they're forced to have their own net zero statement. So what happens is everybody on their own makes their own plan. But again, take something like a mine in the middle of Africa. There's actually a lot of other stakeholders that should be contributing towards the net zero plan and actively engaging on it. It's always just pushed off to the mine. Come up with your net zero plan, and that's it.
So we've been using the two terms, kind of net zero or decarbonization, and then we've been using transition terminology to renewables. Are those always driven by the same factors, or is there good reason to, if you're looking at a new project, whether it's a factory or a mine or whatever it is, a plant, is there already good enough reason to say, well, I am going to have a a renewable first energy strategy going, right from the word go? Does it make financial sense with the technology that we have today?
I definitely believe so. If you look at the cost of putting up solar, of wind where you can, it is, especially in Africa, you got so much opportunity to do it, and it makes a pure economic case to do it. The thing though is it's not something that can be done in isolation. Again, it comes back to the system stability
discussion and so on. Yeah.
But also, it's also about saying, okay, fine, I'm bringing this in, but how can I maximize the use of that? Can I electrify more vehicles? Can I electrify some of my other systems to maximize the benefit I can get from the solar or whatever the case may be? Yeah. And also how you can interplay with your battery storage.
So energy storage, of course, is a big question. If you're lucky enough to have some nice dams and you can have hydroelectric processes to store energy, that's a nice benefit. But not everyone has access to those kinds of, let's call it, natural batteries. And there seems to be a lot of discussion about the environmental impact of the minerals that are required, the kinds of mines that are required to create the battery, or let's call it the energy storage solutions, technologies that we need to go or to be able to provide a consistent source of energy, even when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. What is your opinion about that? Is there really such a thing as environmental net zero or environmental benefit to the energy transition as well? Or do we kind of lose on the swings what we win on the roundabout?
I sometimes think we don't always fully account, and you just look at the solar panel standing in front of you or the battery standing in front of you and say, okay, this is great. It's making it green. But if you look at the total life cycle, it isn't that simple. And definitely there's some accounting that conveniently gets moved by in terms of that.
Yes.
But again, it's about looking at the whole system and saying, what can I, and that's where a bit of more innovation thinking is useful, is to say, how is this going to change over time, and how can I adapt to match that? So that also, a battery is only one use of the solar power, and it does a certain function, but it could actually be doing other functions as well for your localized grid, etc. So you need to look at all those factors together to be able to say, what is the basket of uses I can have for each of these technologies?
And that's, of course, where legislation can play a big role. Again, as you mentioned about maybe a way of having a financial battery is to say, well, I will generate more when I can, sell it and use that money to buy when I cannot generate. And you've created a battery of sorts without having any, physical storage requirements for that, because your financial model makes sense that way. We've talked about, we've talked about that part. We've also talked about, the idea of not having to go for zero carbon or fully, renewable right from the get-go. But what are some of the other biggest mistakes maybe that you see business or political leaders make when approaching energy innovation or sustainability initiatives?
I think, well, first, more at the macro kind of level, I think the one thing that we can see that's changing is that there's more pragmatism around the kind of fuel sources needed in Africa.
Right.
It was we were recently at the Africa Energy Forum, and somebody made the comment, the previous year when it was asked which development financial institutions would look at gas or fuel sources like that, there was only a handful. This year it's changed.
Yes.
There's much more. So I think there's more pragmatism coming in, but I also think in terms of a regulatory engagement, there needs to be a lot more. If you look at South Africa, now it's opening up, and mines or anybody else can deal across the grid. They can do business to business electricity contracts. That makes a big difference. But it is something that across the rest of the continent, there needs to be a lot more work done. And not just Africa, many other developing countries. The more those markets can open up to let everybody participate, the better the system will benefit, and the quicker your decarbonization will come. So that's more at the macro level. But getting back to businesses and innovation around these electricity systems and what needs to happen, I think more at a smaller corporate level. Your biggest challenge is that the innovation is often treated in silos as siloed projects, and people forget you need to have a portfolio strategy around your innovation, and you're going to strike out on quite a few of them over time, right? But if you don't look at it as a strategic investment where you're building up this portfolio, you lose a lot of innovation opportunity, and you don't build internal innovation momentum because it's one-off projects. People try and do something, and maybe it does or doesn't work. If it doesn't work, it just gets shelved and nobody wants to talk about it again. And I think that's quite a pity, actually.
It's been really interesting talking to you about this. Maybe just the last question about the company and what you're working on right now. Your specific role, is there anything specifically that you're working on now that you think could be a good advice to business leaders who are thinking about what to do next?
If you'll allow me, I probably won't talk about the technology specifically, but one or two things that we've learned in the process, if that's okay.
Yes.
I think the one thing is the portfolio and innovation. And something that 5 years ago you tried to innovate on and didn't really work, don't forget about it. Because, 5 years later, suddenly there's a technology change or there's a new software or something that actually can make that thing work. So, and just in a broader sense, it's building up that corporate memory around the innovation. It's probably one of the biggest challenges we found as well, is that people do projects, but those projects don't get brought into the body of knowledge of innovation of what's happened. So besides the skill set, just knowing what happened. And what is also interesting is actually going back to some of the customer interviews we did a few years back, where the customers talk about pain points, which at that point may just simply not have been possible to address. And now when you re-look at those interviews, you suddenly realize, but hold on, we're busy with something that actually fits that specific need. So bringing that body of knowledge with you the whole time is probably one of the most. We're working a lot on developing that, and I think it's one of the things that makes the biggest difference to successful innovation.
Exactly. We thank you so much for your time and your insights. I really enjoyed it. Maybe back to just one personal question. We always make it a little bit personal again at the end of the podcast. Outside of energy and your work in innovation and so on, I should also say, and outside of studying, what do you do in your personal time? What excites you? What are your passions?
Well, actually photography, but what I've done is I've sold my digital cameras and I've just moved to the cell phone with 1 or 2 screw-on lenses, and I've told myself I need to learn to take better quality photos before I upgrade again. So that's my next big challenge.
I think I've given up on that one. I've just learned to accept that my wife can take better pictures than I do. And I can have it's not about the arrow, it's about the Indian. And I'm afraid that you can give me a wonderful bow and arrow, I'm still missing every time. Louis, thank you so much, and all the best that in your initiatives at Wartsila. Thank you for the work that you're doing to work in developing markets, but also, of course, not only there, everywhere else around the globe, to help everyone understand how to think about the energy transition. It's been really good having you on, and all the best in the rest of this year.
It was a pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on, Empie. It was much appreciated, and thoroughly enjoyed the discussion.